On this special edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling, I will welcome guest Donny Chedrick, who will have a very interesting look at all 35 WrestleManias, as he'll give his breakdown on his favorite match, his favorite show, and some other tidbits. We'll also take a look at the recent news for WrestleMania 36 being held at the Performance Center. That's all to come on this edition of the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. And welcome back to another edition. I am your host, Sean Meyers, joined by a very special guest, one Donny Chedrick. Donny, thank you for taking the time. And it's interesting that I have you on the show because for people who were around from the beginning, they might recognize your face. On the initial graphic that I made, I had myself, Sean Saputo, Kyle Dawson, and you as the co-host. It didn't really work out like that, but I've wanted to get you on for quite some time, because I heard about this project you were doing as far as going back and watching every single WrestleMania and grading, evaluating, giving the highs and lows. And you did this in a pretty short period of time. I think it's really interesting because for people like myself who have seen every WrestleMania but maybe haven't seen most of them for years and years, it's a nice little refresher and a good comparison for how the company and the show has evolved over the last 35 years or so. Before we get into that, give your background in terms of how you became a wrestling fan, how long you've been watching, what got you into the business.
Well, Sean, first off, thanks for having me on. I know we tried to, have this happen for a while now, so I'm glad I'm able to do it now, especially after my little WrestleMania viewing project. But I was sort of a boomer of the Ruthless Aggression era. I sort of started watching really as that era took off. The first big time guys that I remember, were an up and coming John Cena, up and coming Batista, Triple H in the middle of his.
Deacon Batista or just Batista?
He was still the Deacon Batista. Okay. His stage whenever he was with Devon Dudley.
Probably did not think he was going to be a future Hall of Famer when you saw that gimmick, but
no, I sort of just thought he was a guy. But yeah, I mean, I getting to see all of those guys, Rey Mysterio, and I was definitely more of a SmackDown guy. I don't know if that was a question that you'll get to, but for the sole reason that was a show that I could watch in its entirety every time. Raw, I always had to tape, and I know that's something a lot of kid wrestling fans. Oh yeah, a lot of kid wrestling fans have had to go through. So, all of the guys from SmackDown really resonated with me more, and that was Cena, Kurt Angle, Mysterio, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Edge, until Edge made the jump to Raw. But it was a lot of those guys, a lot of the SmackDown guys that I really grew to like. But then, as I got older and I watched Raw a lot more, I really watched them more evenly. But then I sort of went on a little hiatus. I don't know if that's a common thing for wrestling fans. But
when are we talking, like 2005 or so?
It probably started around 2008 or 2009. Sort of the time I was in middle school. I pretty much stopped watching it entirely. And then I do remember the moment that I got back into it was whenever Brock Lesnar made his return in 2012 after WrestleMania. Just being that, I had decided to turn it on knowing that WrestleMania was the night before.
So did you watch WrestleMania that preceding night?
No. In fact, the first WrestleMania I ever watched live was WrestleMania 30 because, in my house, my parents were never big on, paying the $70 or whatever it used to be for those big pay-per-views before the network came out. So WrestleMania 30 was the first live one I watched, but I would always try to keep up with it.
On the network, correct?
30 was, yes.
So you only had to pay your $9.95 or $9.99 or whatever a month.
Right. Yeah, because that was the first major event on the network. But the night that Brock Lesnar came back, being that I didn't keep up with it, I didn't really follow any of the Twitter wrestling pages because that was still a pretty early time for Twitter as well. I was truly shocked. It was a jaw-dropping moment, to say the least. But whenever he came back, that really sparked my interest. And I rode through that. Not that I was all dedicated that first year or so that he was back, but then once things started to really pick up for the whole company, and then once the announcement of the network launched, that's whenever that was probably my peak, even to back whenever I was a kid.
And it's interesting because I talked to Eddie Diorio a couple weeks ago, and you know him. He's even younger than you. He's still in college. And he told me he only got into it maybe 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. But he sort of went back and looked into the history, watched the old shows, watched the documentaries. I remember doing that because I started watching in about 1990, which, as you know, was WrestleMania 6 or so. I remember WrestleMania 7, and then from WrestleMania 8 on, I watched them all live. But I also went back and I watched the early WrestleManias, SummerSlams, the Coliseum home video and stuff like that. So you as well, you went back and watched that period you missed, but you also went back into the 90s, even the 80s, and it kind of all comes together with this project that you ended up doing, basically going back and evaluating every WrestleMania. How did that come about? How long did it take you? What was your process in going through it?
So it was after WrestleMania 35, and at my previous job, at a radio station in West Virginia, one of my, it was the head sales guy there. He sort of pitched me the idea because he's also a lifelong wrestling fan. And he's a guy that's in his mid to upper 50s, and he has watched every single episode of Raw and SmackDown ever, whether it's live, taped, whether he watches it on Hulu.
I would say, if anything, I maybe missed 3 or 4 back in the early stages of it, like maybe 94, 95. But I would say at least from the late 90s on, I've seen all of them.
Yeah, so that sort of sparked some of the interest, and then he came up with the idea and said, since he had seen them all live, he said, go back and watch all of the WrestleManias at some point, and you'll really sort of get an understanding and an appreciation of how much the industry has grown over the 35 years that WrestleMania has been a thing. So that was basically all the convincing I needed. I mean, it's not like I wasn't a wrestling fan going into that conversation, and watching all of the WrestleManias was something I wanted to get around to doing anyway, because there were plenty that whenever I was a kid, I never got to see. I mean, I had seen the really notable ones. I had seen 17 and 19 and 20 and 21, but there were so many left out that I didn't get to see. But I went through, I watched every match. I didn't skip a single match.
So you started in order from WrestleMania 1 up to 35. You did so in a span of about 10 months?
Yeah, so it was pretty hot and heavy out of the gate. It was, again, maybe the Monday or Tuesday after WrestleMania 35. It was April 9th was the first, because I have my Twitter thread pulled up. April 9th was my first WrestleMania tweet. It was for WrestleMania 1. And, as you know, WrestleMania is back in the 80s, and even up until, the late 2000s weren't these 5 to 7 hour marathons that we're used to.
Yeah, they were 3 hours or less, right?
Yeah, for the most part. There were some that, went 3.5. I think WrestleMania 4 got pretty close to 4 hours, but that's because there were so many matches.
With the tournament, yep.
And so a lot of those early ones went very quickly. But then once we started to get into the 20s, things slowed down, whether it was my schedule picking up or just the fact that they were so long. The events themselves were so long that I couldn't afford to sit down for 5 hours a day and just knocked them out. So that's sort of what slowed the process in the end. But that first tweet was April 9th, and then the final one was March 9th. So
11 months.
Yeah, so nearly a year that it took me, but I was glad I got it in, and I wanted to make sure I got it done before this year's WrestleMania, which, as we'll get to, might not even be held at the right time.
Right. And I'm going to ask you some specifics momentarily, but just the general thought on what you saw over a 35-year span, what changed? Obviously, a lot changed, but what really stood out when you were able to see it all in a condensed period of time?
It was really cool just to see how, basically everything in the business changed, whether it was the wrestlers themselves, obviously new talent coming in, or, the fans changed. The fans got much smarter as wrestling went on, because you watch one of those early WrestleManias, and I remember it was either WrestleMania 1 or 2 where there was an Intercontinental Championship match, and the face, the good guy, won by count out, so he didn't win the title, and the fans went crazy.
Yeah,
this is at WrestleMania.
It was like a thing back then. Like, they were just so happy for the good guy and hated the bad guy that they didn't even think outside of they were just tunnel vision for what was happening in that single match.
Whereas if you go 10, especially 20 years later, every fan was so much more knowledgeable about the business, maybe not knowing exactly how it should be run, but they knew what they liked and what they didn't. And if it was something like that, they certainly wouldn't be happy with a count-out victory in a title match at the biggest show of the year, because that's whenever you want a lot of closure on the feuds. Maybe if you don't get closure, you get a great start to a feud, something like that. So it was cool to see how the wrestlers changed, how the fans changed, how the styles changed. The match that has always been highly touted, that I said might be a little bit overrated, and I know you'll disagree, but it's the Steamboat Savage match from WrestleMania 3. That's one that everybody has on their list whenever you ask them what's the best WrestleMania match of all time. And, I didn't really get that from that, but I guess I didn't understand, maybe watching it, that in 1987, that was monumental stuff that those two guys were doing. And I did not watch
that live. As I said, I was kind of like 1990 on, but I remember even back then that was always talked about. And I think maybe this will speak a little bit more to it. At what point did you start seeing good wrestling matches? Probably not, at least up until maybe WrestleMania 10, right? For the most part.
Yeah, it would get later on. I know the one really notable match that stuck out to me in those first 10 WrestleManias, that was Ric Flair and Macho Man Randy Savage for the title.
At WrestleMania
but it was
8.
Yeah, and it was, so that's 1992. But that was one where I know I made the comment, it was in the middle of the show, and that's because Hulk Hogan just had the main event, 9 of those first 10 WrestleManias, or else the fans wouldn't be happy.
I mean, he was in the main event of all the first 9 by some form or another.
Yeah, the only one where he wasn't in the actual
4.
match was 4. Yeah, that was DiBiase and Savage.
Yeah, he was out of the tournament earlier. So with that WrestleMania 8 match, no doubt that's a great match, but that was full 5 years after the Steamboat Savage. So I would think if you would look at, let's say, the first 7 WrestleManias, was there a match that was better than Steamboat Savage in ring?
Hard to say. That would probably be the best one there.
And I think that's why it's held, because in that era, it was so much better than the rest. Even if you fast forward another 6-7 years, then you start seeing matches that were that caliber. But I think, you look at the entire 80s in WWF at the time, and people would say that was probably the best match. So it maybe was the best match of a decade in the company. That's why it's held in such high regard, I think.
Right, and because, it's really no secret that Hulk Hogan, for as big of a figure that he was and still is in the wrestling industry, he wasn't a good actual wrestler. So that's probably why I would still say that match stands out. But quite honestly, through those first 9 to 10 WrestleManias, and I know at one point, for whatever reason, I didn't agree with it, but Vince decided to take the wrestling boots away from Randy Savage and put a headset on him, which was a horrible decision. One, because I enjoyed almost every match Randy Savage had at WrestleMania, whether it was for the title or for a mid-card title or just a regular match. He was one of the best wrestlers that I saw out of that first 10, and then he puts a headset on him, and he was awful.
So he
on
was
commentary.
at WrestleMania 9. He was on commentary, correct?
Yes, and that added to why WrestleMania 9 was so bad. That was easily the worst one I watched.
But then he came back and wrestled at WrestleMania 10.
Yeah, he had an odd match at WrestleMania
right?
10.
He and Crush had the match.
Yes.
Okay. And then he went on to WCW and whatnot. So Randy Savage was sort of in terms of in-ring work, he was the MVP for, the first 10 years. When you look at maybe those 10 following years, WrestleMania 10 to 20, and I know you said you had seen some of these prior to this project, it seems like that's sort of your sweet spot, and I think for a lot of fans, a sweet spot because wrestling was at its highest popularity. What stands out about WrestleMania 10 to 20? We're talking, like 95 to 2005 or so in that time frame?
Yeah, WrestleMania 10 was 94, and then WrestleMania 20 was 04. And again, that's where you saw sort of 2 to 3 eras mixing over each other, because you had the new era, I think is what Vince wanted to call it whenever he started to get younger. And he was, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Was it the new era?
That
or was
might
it
be Next Generation, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
They were combating WCW, who signed all of their veterans, like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, and mocking them openly about them being old.
Yeah. So, and it's funny if you fast forward today to how, all of that can come back and match what we saw 20 some years ago. But that's whenever it was the Harts, Bret Hart and Owen Hart, which those guys had a great match at WrestleMania 10. I know that one's always talked about. Shawn Michaels, who quite honestly, I would probably say if you just talk about WrestleManias, just match quality, not overall record, I think Shawn Michaels is the best WrestleMania performer ever. Because if you count records, you say Undertaker, but just for matches I enjoyed, and I know I listed off a good bit of, my favorite matches, but just so many memorable ones that aren't even in that top tier list. But, the ladder match with Razor Ramon
and that,
at WrestleMania
was revolutionary 10. Because while it wasn't the first ladder match, it was the one that everyone remembers starting that as a gimmick match.
Yes. Yeah, then you go 2 years later, he has the Iron Man match with Bret Hart, and it was those two guys that were two of the best in the industry. And then once you get to that late 90s point, that's whenever, to steal a JR line, that's whenever business started to pick up for me. WrestleMania 13 and pretty much forward, they all got really enjoyable.
Now, I remember 13... there was a lot of, the main event was kind of a mess, right?
Yeah, because that was Undertaker and Psycho Sid.
Which I think got changed 3 or 4 times because the rumor was Shawn Michaels wasn't happy with how it was supposed to play out, and then they did all sorts of storylines with that. But I think your takeaway from that probably was the Austin-Bret Hart match, right?
Yeah, because that could honestly be the single best wrestling match in WrestleMania history. Plus... 13, you saw the debut of The Rock, debut of Mick Foley, which obviously those two have gone on to be two of the biggest stars of the Attitude Era. The Rock, quite possibly the biggest star of all time. He's in that debate at least. But then things just really got rolling once the Attitude Era picked up. And then you follow that with the Ruthless Aggression Era, at least the first few years of that. Once you get into WrestleMania 19 and 20, they didn't really skip a beat, because I thought WrestleMania 17 through like WrestleMania 21. That was probably the best 4 to 5 stretch for WrestleMania in history. I had all of those pretty highly rated, and even 18, which I don't know what date you'll publish this, but 18 was 20 or 18 years ago today, and that has perhaps the best crowd moment
with
in WrestleMania history.
Yeah. I remember that match. I was in high school at the time, and I remember thinking, like, this is a match that's always going to live. You know what I mean? Because going into that match, some people don't realize, and I'm sure you probably do now, but for people watching at the time, Hogan was the heel. And it certainly did not seem like it once that match began.
Yeah, and the fact that it was in Toronto, so it was in Canada. I don't know if that had anything to do with
Hogan
it,
had already main evented a WrestleMania 12 years prior.
Right. Yeah, it was the Ultimate Warrior one. So that atmosphere was pretty much untouched. By anything. You could even say the Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, title parade at the end of 20. The celebration at the end of WrestleMania 30 with Daniel Bryan. I don't think anything matched the fight atmosphere that The Rock and Hulk Hogan had, just because there was just
it was
untouched
like
energy.
Generations icons clashing too, right?
Yeah,
they always say
it's the biggest guy.
Mike Trout versus Babe Ruth, or whatever analogy you want to make, but it really did feel like that, and both guys were still capable of having a match. I mean, Hogan was never good, but he was still good enough.
Right, and you brought up the Mike Trout thing, and I always have said that the little pre-match analysis that Jerry the King Lawler has might be like the best comment he's made on the mic in WWE history, and it all fits in so well, because JR, everything he says is just gold at that point in time, and Jerry the King Lawler ends up saying, we never got to see Babe Ruth and Barry Bonds, we'll never see Tyson and Ali, but we do get to witness The Rock and the Hulk. And then right after that, the bell rings, and it just sets a pretty good stage for things. But the whole match too, and it's unfortunate that it was in the middle to late part of the show, and it wasn't the main event.
Yeah,
and I know
if
that
I'm correct, there was that match, and then they probably had some filler women's match or something stupid, and then they did the main event, which really suffered because of how good Hogan and The Rock was.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, because I think if they just move some things around, we would be talking about WrestleMania 18 to be one, probably not as good as 17 or 19 or maybe even 20, but one that I probably would have put in the 8 range instead of a 6.6, which is what I gave it out of 10. But you got to see RVD and Booker T. That was their first WrestleMania. The Flair Undertaker match was another pretty good crossover.
Right,
I think that's
that really
underappreciated.
Right, yeah, it's really not even considered in the same boat, but those guys are pretty darn close, if not exceeding Hogan and The Rock.
Right, so you got 2 matches like that at the same WrestleMania. You get Flair and Undertaker, and then you get the involvement of Arn Anderson, which makes that match somewhat interesting, because they just had Undertaker dominate most of the match. Then you get Rock and Hogan, and then you do get a good match from Jericho and Triple H. It's just the crowd is so drained at that point, and you really can't blame them, because,
which, by the way, that's a problem when they do these obscenely long WrestleManias now, because the Becky Lynch, Ronda Rousey, and Charlotte, like, it was too late in the night. People were just like, just end, I need to go home, that type of deal.
Yeah, and you know that firsthand, going there last year and being in the crowd for nearly 8 hours. It's pretty remarkable almost how long they make it.
To the point where the main event doesn't have the most excitement. Let's kind of fill out the last 12 to 15 years of WrestleMania. As you said, there was the Ruthless Aggression era that sort of spanned into those middle years. What have you seen over the recent WrestleManias, the last decade plus?
So do you want me to start from like what 20 or WrestleMania 23 or so.
Did you see like a divide per se in how the show was presented, the feel of it? Was there anything noticeable that shifted at any particular year or span of a couple years?
I felt like there was somewhat of a shift after 21, because once you got to 22, not that it wasn't a huge event before, and not that they hadn't had it in stadiums before, but that was the first time that I felt that they really just wanted to make it, a monumental size, and they wanted to do it every year because, even though they had the Silver
Detroit?
Dome, 22, yeah, that was Ford Field.
Okay, because 21 was at Staples, I believe, right? In LA.
Yes. Yeah, so then they would start to get, they would go from having crowds of, 30,000, maybe 40,000, and step it up a notch to 70,000 pretty much every year, because then you had Ford Field. They went to, I think Chicago was 23, so they maybe took a step back there. But then 24, 25 and on, you pretty much see all of those in football stadiums that can only fit upwards of 65,000 plus people.
Right.
And then you add in all of the floor seats and everything.
And most of them are outdoor venues too.
Right. So then that's where you really saw everything start to pick up in terms of attendance. And then you definitely had some down years in there, but they still kept up with some pretty good events. I thought 23 and 24 hold their own to be pretty good shows. Certainly some duds in there, but one of the things that also helped some of those WrestleManias in the early 20s is that they had the Money in the Bank match, before they made that a separate event. And
I
Money in the Bank,
loved that at WrestleMania.
What's that?
I thought it was great at WrestleMania. I understand why they want to make another big pay-per-view based around it, but I thought it was a major piece of not just throwing guys in there randomly, but they were significant wrestlers who were just outside of like the main event matches that got in that Money in the Bank.
Yeah, and the first one was at 21, and I remember noting that 22, I said it was a decent Money in the Bank match, but in parentheses I said there's rarely a bad one. So there was another good one at 23, a very good one at 24. And then, things start to go downhill a little bit. 25 was pretty so-so, but you got the Undertaker Shawn Michaels match. That was pretty much the highlight. 26
and
again,
another the first of their two matches, correct?
Yeah, because
I think
26
that one to me was better, because I thought the next year they kind of just tried to do the same thing but one up it, and I don't like when they try to do that with matches. And I say that even now, Johnny Gargano and Adam Cole with their pay-per-view runs of takeovers, I always usually think the first one is the best one. Not always, but it usually seems like it works out like that. I certainly felt that way about Michaels and Taker.
Yeah, and then 26, you pretty much got the same thing. Some okay stuff, but a lot of messy stuff. That was never an old Bret Hart wrestled Vince McMahon, and it was a mess. But you got, some decent title matches, and then you got Shawn Michaels and Undertaker 2, which that also, counts as the end of Shawn Michaels' career, at least for the time being.
Until Saudi Arabia.
And then 27, I thought, was one of the weakest ones, really, of the modern era. The Rock was the guest host that had the...
That was Cena Miz main event.
Yeah, it had the bizarre ending where it was a count out, I believe, and then The Rock restarted it, and he interfered, and that's how Miz won. Only 2 titles got defended on that whole show.
How does that happen?
I have no idea, especially for WrestleMania nowadays. I could understand back then whenever they had a show with only 2 titles defended, because for a lot of the time there were only 3 to 4
right
that they had in the company. But there was really one highlight of 27, that was Triple H and Undertaker. which again, they went and had a second one at 28, and that was actually their third Mania match because they had a very good one at 17 that people kind of forget about for how stacked WrestleMania 17 was.
I tell you why I remember that match, because that's when I realized they are intentionally having The Undertaker win all of his matches at WrestleMania. That was the first time where it really clicked, like, okay, Triple H is the guy who probably should have won, but they had Undertaker win, and he's undefeated, and now they're starting to talk about it. So, like, that's a thing that they're doing. That's when it really dawned on me they were trying to go with, like, a streak for The Undertaker at Mania.
At 17?
Yes.
Yeah, because I remember that being a very good match, and I would agree with you.
That was the biker version of Taker too.
Yes.
So you pulled within about the last 7 or 8 years, and then of course WrestleMania has become almost ridiculous in terms of its length and everyone being involved in some capacity, whether it be on the pre-show. Literally, almost the entire roster that's healthy is involved in some way. Has expanding WrestleMania to this long, where there's so many battle royals and so many, they have the fatal 4-way tag team matches on each show for the titles, where they're just throwing matches out there. Has it diluted WrestleMania and the matches and getting on the card for you?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I don't know if they'd really have a solution to that, and they wouldn't listen to me or you if we ever pleaded that, hey, you got to make these shorter, because if anything, they're going to get longer. But the special thing about WrestleMania is that they were supposed to be the premier matches and premier feuds of the year, or of the last handful of months, and they did a good job at WrestleMania 30 and 31, but that was really the point where WrestleMania started to get long. It just so happened that a lot of different things were memorable out of those two Manias that made them so good.
And that's because they don't have the time constraints on the network, right? That was a big part of it, I believe.
Right. And I would say that a perfect length for Mania, not that they would even have to cut it down all that much. I think a 4-hour event does the job just fine. Maybe have a 1-hour pre-show, but if you do a show from 7 to 11.
I think pre-show you start at 6 to 7, because it currently starts at 5 and it runs 2 hours. And I think Mania goes 7 to 11. If they absolutely have to, your final match finishes right before 11:30. But anything past 11:30 is too late. Anything before 6 is too early. So to me, I would say 6 to 11, 6 to 11:30 would be the absolute longest. But again, like you said, it doesn't seem like any company is trending in the direction of shorting wrestling shows at this point. And it's not just a WWE thing either.
Yeah, and I do think it dilutes it, because if you think back, the roster is huge now, so they want to try to get everybody involved. But the roster was huge in the early 2000s as well, right after Vince pretty much encapsulated all of WCW. So you had all of those guys, a lot of the old ECW guys as well. And unless you really stood out and deserved to be on the biggest show of the year, you weren't on it. That's why I felt that, shows like WrestleMania 19, WrestleMania 20 and 21 were all very well done. Some of my favorite WrestleManias there. But again, with Vince having control of the time, and he can pretty much run these as long as possible, that's why they won't get any shorter. 30 and 31, though, you have the Daniel Bryan moment at 30. You have the Undertaker streak ending at 30. You have the start of the show with 3 of the biggest legends in history, with Hogan, Rock, and Austin.
No, that wasn't, just to clarify, that was just them gathering. It wasn't any, match or anything.
Yes, yeah, it was just them having a good time, but still getting to see those guys is always exciting. And then 31, you had a terrific match to start. They did the Intercontinental title ladder match. You get Triple H and Sting, which, you can say it's overbooked or a mess, but people getting to see the NWO and DX definitely brought excitement. You got to see Ronda Rousey. That's when you got the first cash in WrestleMania history.
With Seth.
But then,
yeah,
right.
that I thought was a really great ending. Even though I thought it was pretty clear it was going to happen, I thought that was awesome because it was different and hadn't been done, and it was the culmination of real long-term booking in a sense.
Right, and I just feel like after those two, Vince has tried to maybe match that magic, and he hasn't been able to do so. 32, I think, is and should be considered a dud. The best moment of 32 might be Zack Ryder winning the Intercontinental title,
which he lost the next night, I think.
Yes, and other than that, you had the women's triple threat. That was the real birth of the women's revolution.
Right.
And the only other memorable thing from 32 is the debut of AJ Styles. Then you get to 33. Again, a couple of memorable things, but you get the return of the Hardy Boys, and that's pretty much it. 34, debut of Ronda Rousey. Return of Daniel Bryan. But again, really that was pretty much it. Brock and Roman wasn't as good as the first time.
That was I absolutely hated how that finished.
A little kid won a tag team title. I thought
Nicholas a shout out. Come on, he deserves it. He's in the record books.
Styles and Nakamura I thought was solid, but could have definitely given more. Otherwise, though, it's like those last few years, it hasn't been able to match what we got at 30 and 31, and I think that's something that Vince has been trying to chase because then even last year, you try for the special moments. So you do get Kofi Kingston winning the title, which was
I feel like Vince gave the fans what they wanted with a lot of the big matches last year, but it just didn't come off great.
Right, and then you get the women's match, but you mentioned that since that was in hour 7 of the show, everybody was drained.
And it honestly just wasn't as good as some of the matches we saw with Charlotte and Becky and some other Ronda Rousey matches, to be honest. I just thought it was a little below what they were capable of. It ended a little prematurely, and like I said, people were dying for that to end so that they could leave.
Correct, and then it also just had the awkward ending where I don't know how the feeling was at the event, but I
was expecting someone to come out and say this match is going to continue.
Okay, because a lot of us watching, in a group setting, we all saw it and thought, like, did they just mess that up? And I feel like that's not what Vince or anybody in the company wants the people to say.
I think you have to have
watching
a
match.
Yeah, you don't end WrestleMania's main event with a roll up. So you kind of ran through, especially the recent ones. So I kind of want to get the best of, worst of. You mentioned you thought WrestleMania 9 was the worst. So give me the best, or a couple at least, that were in contention, because you did grade each of these shows, correct?
Yeah. So WrestleMania 9 was the worst. I gave that a 2.5 out of 10. It really only had one decent match, and then even then. It had a goofy finish. Right.
That's with Hogan not even being in the match and then winning the title from Yoko so that they could have the good guy win and all that. So that's the worst. Was that pretty clearly the worst WrestleMania?
Yeah, I thought the only one really near it was probably 11.
Lawrence Taylor and Bam Bam Bigelow.
Yeah, I gave that a 4.25. Or I think WrestleMania 4 was one of the worst ones too, but that's just simply because they tried to squeeze so many matches into, 3.5 to 4 hours. There just wasn't enough time. It was awkwardly done, I thought, and really nothing memorable from the whole show because it was all that tournament. So I would say the 3 worst, 9 being the all-time worst, then 4 or 11, whichever one you want to do. And yeah, 11 had Lawrence Taylor and Bam Bam Bigelow in the main event, not the title match between Kevin Nash and Shawn Michaels.
And Pamela Anderson and Jenny McCarthy and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think I even commented that they were worried at that point about the eye candy and star power over actual wrestling, storytelling,
Right.
the essential things to wrestling.
Conversely, give me the best and maybe the ones that were closest to challenging for best ever.
Well, I went with 17, and I know that that's the popular pick. I gave 17 a 9.7 because
Give us
it's
the
just
cliff notes. I think a lot of people know that was the Rock and Austin Part 2, the second time that they battled, and that's when Austin did his heel turn. But give me some cliff notes of that WrestleMania.
so that had the Spot Fest hardcore title match. It was a triple threat. They went all over the arena.
Is that
Kurt
Raven
Angle,
Raven and Kane like driving golf carts and stuff? Is that
yeah, it's
okay?
Raven, Kane, and Big Show. Yeah, but it was it was in the backstage areas all over. Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit, quite honestly, could be the best technical wrestling match that WWE has ever shown, just because they pretty much went out there and they truly wrestled.
Right.
Shane and Vince in a street fight, not that it was a great wrestling match, but that's where storytelling came into play. You had a couple different things involved. Linda, whenever she was, drugged up, and then she rose out of her seat,
And that was
the
the whole,
crowd
like,
lost their minds.
Trish was like sort of with Vince and everything, right?
Yes, yeah, and then you got the coast to coast with the trash can and everything, and Mick Foley was the special guest ref. That was TLC 2. I know that's not your favorite tag match, but that is probably number one for me. And then it also had that Undertaker Triple H match, which I think it's not appreciated enough because of how stacked the rest of the show is, but a good match. My favorite, though, was 19.
You said 19?
Really, when I started to watch, because, yeah. So, it was the Lesnar Angle main event, and even though it had the botch, everybody jumps on the botch and says it kind of ruins the match, but I thought the fact that Lesnar was able to get up from that, hit an F5, and finish the match meant even more to me, because that match is outstanding. I mean, it's two of the best athletes that have ever been employed by the company. Triple H and Booker T, I think that's a better match than what people give credit. Just kind of a questionable feud, for some of the things that happened. And
that's
I
when
think
Booker was coming basically as the WCW champion, or am I wrong on that?
It was about a year or two removed there.
Okay.
But Triple H was the world heavyweight champion, and I think I had at least the feeling watching it like it seemed like more people thought Booker T would win, and he probably should have going into it. But that was during that time where Triple H, if he lost, he's going to win it the next month anyway. That's just sort of how it was in that 03 to 05 range. Rock and Austin 3, finished up their rivalry, the last match there. That was Stone Cold's last match ever.
And really, for The Rock, it was kind of his swan song as well. I mean, he would still wrestle after that, but like in terms of becoming a part-timer, that sort of started.
Yeah. And that was the first and only time The Rock beat him. So I think they did that pretty well. Hogan and McMahon had a street fight. Again, not great wrestling, but I thought what they did with it was awesome. It's definitely entertaining.
And
They
that's
did
the
the whole
visual of Vince rising up with the...
Yeah. That's probably a top 5, top 10 iconic shot in wrestling history with Vince's bloody face rising over the apron. You get the interference from Roddy Piper, and it makes for all of that. Shawn Michaels and Jericho in the middle of that show was fantastic.
Right. Now this was in Seattle, right? Safeco Field.
Yeah, and then even with Lesnar winning the title, that was his first WrestleMania, and it was only one of 2 that he was in the early 2000s. Also the WrestleMania debut of Rey Mysterio. But that's a really stacked one. There's also some good tag matches in there that I couldn't even really note.
Right.
but then like I said, that stretch from 17 to like 21 is just really good, because WrestleMania 20, which I know is one of your personal favorites, had some great moments.
And
really,
the thing about 20 is I just remember how star-studded it was, even if some of the matches weren't great, like the Evolution versus Rock and Sock. There was nothing great about that, but think of the 5 guys who were in that match.
yeah, every single one of those guys a Hall of Famer.
Orton, Batista, and Flair against The Rock and Mick Foley. That's just insane to think that wasn't even close to the biggest match there.
Yeah, because and the real downer you got there was the Lesnar Goldberg, and even with that being such a, you could say, cringeworthy match,
we might get it again. My friend. Don't rate the door on this. There's a good chance that will happen again at some point.
Well, they sort of got to redeem it at 33, because I thought they put on a way better match there. But the thing is, for how much people dislike that match at 20, everybody remembers it.
Correct.
Everyone remembers,
it's
how
one of those
disappointed
things where, like, it
they
doesn't
were.
have to be a great match. I think people just wanted to see it, to see how it play out.
Right. And
Speaking of matches, I know this is awfully tough, but quickly run through what you think some of the best matches of all time at WrestleMania were.
okay, so I made sure to list those so I could do it relatively quickly. I just went in order of the Mania, because I don't know if I could truly order them.
That's fair.
So that Flair Savage match at WrestleMania 8 was the first,
And I will
head
always
turner.
vividly remember how much Mr. Perfect and Bobby Heenan played a part in that. Heenan on commentary, Perfect at ringside. They were so invested in that, and Heenan was incredible at getting into a match where he made sure that you knew how much it meant to him, and I think that was conveyed pretty well, that it meant a lot to the fans too, because they could see how he was on every single near fall, hanging on the edge of his seat.
Right, yeah, that's one of the things we didn't really comment on, about how the commentary to teams changed over time. But I love the Gorilla Monsoon, Jesse the Body Ventura, Bobby the Brain Heenan team. I really didn't like Vince as a commentator. I don't know how you felt, but he just screamed pretty much about everything.
What a maneuver!
But after that one, I put Austin and Bret Hart at 13. That might be the most iconic.
Yep.
Shot in Mania history. The Stone Cold, blood face, while he pretty much he doesn't tap out, but as he passes out and loses that match.
And that was the old
TLC,
double turn. That was a very rare thing where they turned Bret heel and Austin face, and it worked perfectly. And that makes me miss that Vince McMahon that had the foresight to do that, because it doesn't seem like he does that very much anymore.
Yes. TLC 2 at 17. Lesnar and Angle at 19. The triple threat at WrestleMania 20, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, and Chris Benoit.
Let me ask you this, because I've always wondered this. You watched that match. Do you remember the spot where Michaels started bleeding? He took a catapult into...
Yes, off the post.
Okay, do you remember as soon as his head hit, and he was not even down on the mat yet, he spun and there was blood all over his face?
Okay.
I've always thought about how he did that, and if he was blading himself before he got catapulted. But I'll say, because it's almost 20 years later and I still don't know, that was one of the most impressive blade jobs and spots ever, even though I'm not a fan of blading at all. I think it's very much unnecessary. The fact that he did it that perfectly just will always stand out about that match. And Michaels was a guy who, he did that a lot, and it really, in a sense, added some drama to the match, and I thought it worked perfectly. I think he and Triple H really bought into making Benoit look like a star by the time that WrestleMania was over.
Yeah, well, yeah, and as you say that, he had several matches that you can think of where, he would just be a bloody mess by the end of it. I always appreciated and sort of looked into the comparisons between the WrestleMania 20 journey and main event with WrestleMania 30, because I know that's sort of a theory out there It turns into a triple threat. The little guy finally comes out on top because even though Benoit was a big dude, he was only about 5'8". They did it basically with the same move. The yes lock is the crossface. Just their similar styles and everything. I know their first feud after winning the title was against Kane both times. So that was another reason, but also just the whole celebration afterwards. You get to see Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit in the ring, both of them champions of their respective shows. Eddie beating Kurt Angle earlier that night. He was the champion on SmackDown. Benoit was the champion on Raw. And, just to think that 3 to 4 years later, both of those guys are gone.
Right.
That makes it even more special. And I know Guerrero was tragic, and I know Benoit, even though it was tragic, it has that that asterisk next to it because of how it happened. But you don't really match many moments like the one those guys had. Then the very next year, Shawn Michaels again, he and Kurt Angle at 21, and then Shawn Michaels against The Undertaker at both 25 and 26. So that's sort of why I say that Shawn Michaels is probably the best WrestleMania performer, because I gave 4 matches there with him in it, and you can even think of others that stand out. That ladder match.
Him and Ric Flair, him and Razor Ramon at 10, both of those for what they meant for this business. Even if you say that in ring they weren't the best, which I think WrestleMania 10 was terrific in the ring, but what they meant for this business, one with really innovating the ladder match, the other with the retirement of Ric Flair, and something that wrestling really hadn't done a lot of, which was like retirements as part of a storyline that actually stuck.
Yeah, and then also the Iron Man match at WrestleMania 12. That was the only Iron Man match in WrestleMania history. And, it was a bit slow, and that's part of the reason why it was just 1 fall to 0, but a good match at that, and a groundbreaking match at that with Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart.
So, great insight. Final thing on this before we touch very quickly on the current situation. You did this in 11 months, and I know you're going to do it with TakeOver, and I think probably down the road, and we're going to have a lot of time on our hands. You'll try to get it in with SummerSlam and Royal Rumble as well, and I guess at that point, maybe years down the road, you look at doing the same for Survivor Series. But what was your biggest, eye-opening aspect of this, your biggest takeaway from doing this whole project, if you will?
It was sort of one of the goals that I had going in, and it was just to appreciate how far the business has come, because it's indescribable how much has changed since WrestleMania 1, in March of 1984, 1985 to 2020. It's because you can't even really tell somebody if they asked you, well, what's the difference between 1 and 35? You'd have to write a book on it before you just tell them. It would be very similar,
I would say, with like the Super Bowl, right? Dating back to the late 60s to what it is now, just in every aspect, the media circus around it, the presentation, in addition to the athleticism and the superiority with the skills and speed and whatnot. It really is very similar. Yeah,
and you can see similarities between then and now. It truly was a spectacle whenever it was WrestleMania 1. But if you ever watch it and really listen to the commentary too, the way that Gorilla Monsoon and even Vince to a point portrays it, they don't know if they'll ever have a WrestleMania 2. So they didn't know if that would be the only WrestleMania in history. So now to see 35 years later, we're heading into yet another WrestleMania, which we don't know if it'll be on time, but they're 35 in to this WrestleMania journey. You see all the things that have changed in the business. In the late 90s, Vince survives another near scare whenever WCW becomes a big player. He got by all of that. So given everything that has changed, the talent, the the fans, the styles, the whole aspect of things, the spectacle that it's become. Vince has pretty much remained that constant. And I know some of the things he does makes people hope that he steps down at some point in the near future, especially whenever you see what we get on the main roster compared to what Triple H can do with the NXT talent. But it's incredible to think that it made it this far after it was such a risk at the very beginning.
I want to get less than 5 minutes here, just very quickly touching on this. And again, this is something that Justin Lowry and I will talk about in the future. And I was originally planning on bringing an end to this podcast the week before WrestleMania, but it looks like everyone's going to have a lot more free time, so I might have to kind of extend it until things get back to normal. But WrestleMania is going to be very bizarre this year. I still believe that what we've been told now will not ultimately come to fruition, but it was announced yesterday before Raw. WrestleMania will take place same date, same time, in the Performance Center, closed only to the performers and essential personnel, which is basically cameraman, announcers. That's about it. This seems like the worst decision they could have made because they've already had a Raw and a SmackDown in this, and as I put the photos up, it's just bizarre. And I think they've already made pretty significant adjustments when they had 3 or 4 matches on SmackDown that probably spanned, I don't know, about 30 or 40 minutes. They've cut that down to basically a 10-minute match on Raw last night as the only in-ring action that they had because it comes across so terribly. And I think, and no one's really saying this other than me, it's still a very hazardous environment because if one wrestler has this virus, it's going to be spread very quickly with how hands-on and physical wrestling is. It seems like a mistake to do this at all, but Vince is, I think, in the words of Justin Lowry, he has a God complex that he won't let anything stop him from doing WrestleMania. And to me, having it in an empty venue, it's going to hurt a lot of money that would be coming in with ticket sales and revenue if you pushed it back to, the late summer, whenever. But it's just going to create a moment that I think will tarnish, in a sense, WrestleMania. And I know people can see it the other way. I don't see it that way. I think this is absolutely a negative, and everyone, performers, fans alike, are really going to be cheated out what could have been a great moment if you just had some more patience.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a fan of it. And I know you mentioned the Vince McMahon God complex, and you must be forgetting whenever Vince had a tag team match against God.
Right. Vince won that one
back in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, Vince beat him.
I believe he did. Yeah, because God never made his way to the ring. But yeah, I'm really not a fan of the decision at all. To have the biggest wrestling event of the year, and what we just got done saying, what a big deal it is, what a spectacle it is. It's a whole performance of things. It's not your regular episode of Raw or SmackDown.
And yet this will look identical to what Raw and SmackDown have looked like this past week and probably for the next 3 weeks to come.
Right, and it'll look awful because
it was kind of like the first time it's all right. We'll see it. Sometimes they crack some jokes about it. I don't know if you saw when Austin was out last night. He said something to the crowd, and they panned to the empty seats, and I cracked up. But that joke isn't going to be funny in 2 or 3 weeks.
Right, yeah, and that also made me upset thinking that should have been me because that show was supposed to be in Pittsburgh, and, probably the only chance I'll ever get to see Stone Cold Steve Austin live just went down the tubes because of a worldwide pandemic. But I also agree with you that it is a very dangerous situation for them. Plus, it's not like Florida has a lack of confirmed cases either. And as soon as one person gets it, that whole locker room's going to get it.
And that's why I think that something will come up. And it might not even be a notable wrestler. It could be anyone that's there. But I just remember watching SmackDown and thinking how ignorant and how oblivious are they with Triple H, who seems like a very likable guy in some senses. He's shaking Michael Cole's hand, and then Michael Cole's adjusting Mojo Rawley's headset. And it's like, we've been told not to do this, and you're doing it and making light of it. Triple H was drawing on Michael Cole's face. They're just asking for trouble because every other major sport deemed, even in closed venues, it was not safe to go forward. What makes WWE the exception? Well, the answer is Vince McMahon thinks he is the exception to everything.
Well, that's also why for a while I guess part of me had faith that we would get to see that show because as everything was getting canceled, I thought, if one guy doesn't cancel, it is Vince McMahon. He's the one guy that will not let something stop him. So until they basically made it a government mandate to shut everything down that had, a number of people, that was the first time that I realized, like, okay, well, we're not going to get to see it. Because
again, I think the best situation is, hey, let's hope late June, July, even if it's into August. And if you have to give up SummerSlam, that's not as big of a deal as having WrestleMania at the Performance Center.
Yeah, I think that there could definitely be a way where they could pull it off to, if they have to delay Mania, which, again, I think is the right decision, maybe delay SummerSlam a few weeks or something, although it kind of takes away from the name if you have SummerSlam in the fall. However, I think in at this point in time, people would understand that. So you could also maybe sacrifice a few of your smaller events. And, if things get better, I don't know when that'll happen. None of us really know when that'll happen. But if we have a summer where it's just WrestleMania, a handful of weeks, do maybe Money in the Bank, or, if you don't have the time for that, make it WrestleMania, give it a handful of weeks, and do SummerSlam.
And someone said, I don't know who the person was on Twitter, but they said it would be awesome if when everyone is allowed to continue to do these sporting events, when they return, if WrestleMania was the first show back. I know that's super hard to plan because there's a lot that goes into WrestleMania, but if they were to say, hey, we think June 1st, everyone's going to be okay to return to their normal life, have WrestleMania be the first WWE show back, that would be so well received. Everyone there would love it. They wouldn't nitpick and complain about stupid stuff with, oh, this match should have gone 5 minutes longer. They would embrace that. But we're not getting that instead. And I know Vince and the wrestlers who kind of have to say it because they don't want to tick off Vince, well, we're trying to give you a distraction from this terrible thing. But to me, it's just ill-advised.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that because once again, by that point, somebody in the company could have it. It's spread. They've not
already tested every person. I can tell you that. They're not testing all of these healthy people and determining. And by the way, I just got news now. Kevin Durant is confirmed, and 4 members of the Brooklyn Nets. So they haven't played basketball for what, 5 or 6 days at least. But we just found out now there's 4 people. So let's say one wrestler had it a week ago, wrestled on SmackDown. Well, now everyone that they wrestled on SmackDown and everyone that those people have come in contact with could have it. It's just, I honestly think
if one person in a whole arena, a whole locker room, at least WWE wise, because I don't know how they're really splitting things up now since they can't really do live events, being that no fans can go. If one person on SmackDown has it, the entire SmackDown locker room will get it. If one person on Raw has it, the entire locker room will eventually get it because it spreads so aggressively, and it can stay on surfaces for up to 2 weeks, I think.
And again, this is what wrestling's sort of about. Wrestling is predicated on touching people.
Yes, and just think of the smallest things where one wrestler that has it touches the ropes. All those wrestlers are going to go off the ropes. All those wrestlers are going to hit the ground at some point. Like, it's nearly impossible to keep anybody in that setting safe.
Well, hopefully, and again, I'm not rooting against WWE or anyone there, but I hope that they make a better decision, and I hope more than anything else that everyone's okay. You certainly understand my dilemma with it, why I actually have a friend in the company who has to go through with this because that's what the orders are. To me, this is certainly a non-essential thing, so better off just having WWE Network content, basically. But they're not going to do that, at least until they absolutely have to change it. We'll see. But if you do this again years down the road, there's no doubt that WrestleMania 36 will feel completely different from all the other ones when you're doing your next review of the grandest spectacle of them all.
Yeah, without a doubt, especially if they go through with it in an empty arena.
I thought this was awesome that you were able to kind of share this with everyone. This is something that I wanted to do for a long time, so I appreciate it. Once again, if people are interested in following you on Twitter, we have the Twitter handle right there. And again, I will clarify, I had a plan to, in 2 weeks, wrap up this show, but as long as I'm sitting around with plenty of time, and a lot of my friends are, we'll try to continue it. We'll have to kind of depend on if we get weekly programming as well from WWE and AEW, which is, I believe, planning to have a show tomorrow as well. Same type of environment, which, again, not a good idea, whether it's WWE or AEW. Just don't do it. But nonetheless, we will be back, I believe, next week to discuss more here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. If you're interested, 5-Star Pod Wrestle on Twitter, Instagram, 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling. For my special guest, Donny Chedrick, this is Sean Meyers signing off. We'll catch you again next week here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling.